Please allow me to present Professor Mike Raco. He's Chair of Urban Governance and Development at the Bartlett School of Planning, not Architecture. So it was a mistake.
We're all one happy family.
Yeah. So Mike's academic journey started at Royal Holloway University in London, followed by several lectureships at the universities of Glasgow, Reading, King's College, before assuming his current position. It's worth noting that starting this September, I think it's public information by now, he will also take on the role of the head of department at the Bartlett School of Planning. Mike's research involves around critical themes that shape our cities and societies. He possesses expertise in the governance and planning of cities, politics of urban diversity, dynamic nature of welfare states, especially this theme, welfare states, and their transformation has been in the core of his work. With a multidisciplinary background in planning, geography, and urban studies, he also authored numerous influential publications. One of his recent and noteworthy research projects is titled "What is Governed in Cities?", which also gives the title to this presentation, and where we also collaborated together for a couple of years. It was a very productive project, yielded lots of publications, including his most recent book titled London, which provides valuable insights derived from this project. And if you are interested, it's available in our library. You can have access to it. Mike's scholarly contributions also include significant works on the future of sustainable cities, state-led privatization and demise of democratic state, and regeneration of London. And I'm sure, and I see a couple of students who are sitting around the table who have been reading a lot of Mike's publications around the regeneration, especially of the Olympics in London. Mike, it's a tremendous honor to have you here. Your research and teaching endeavors greatly influence our understanding of urban governance. So as a UGoveRN group, I'm very, very happy that you could come in. And let's give him a warm welcome and welcome him for his presentation.
Well, thank you for that very warm, very generous introduction. And Tuna, thank you very much. And I have to say, yesterday I had to give a presentation to my new school about what I would do as head of department. So anything after that feels like a joyous release, if I'm honest. And hopefully I'll keep doing some research on my so-called quiet Fridays, I told the department, but let's see if that really happens. I doubt it. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the wider writing that I've been doing for the last, I always say the last 10 years, I guess it probably is really, on some wider intellectual projects that I've been sharing with others like Tuna and Sarah and Andre here in this room as well, around trying to really understand some basic questions about how cities are governed, who is governing them, and how do they shape what happens in the built environments in which we live. Very straightforward questions, but as we'll be seeing during the next 40 minutes or so, there are some pretty complicated answers to those questions in the London case. The book, I was very lucky to work with Francis Brill, who was a postdoc researcher at the Bartlett, followed by Callum Ward. I was very lucky on the project, and Sarah was involved, and Andre and Tuna, as well as a big team of researchers looking at some of these wider questions. So just to acknowledge Francis's work in this. And as Tuna says, how do you move it on? Okay. As Tuna says, the book is unimaginatively titled London. The reason for that rather flat title is that it's part of a megacity series edited by Hank Savage. So there's a number of these books coming out in different cities. And we came up with a very dramatic subtitle, but it was just kicked out. It's not there, which I think is a problem, actually, because if you're looking up London, it is a word that does appear quite a lot on Google. If you put it in. So the book doesn't necessarily come up quite as quickly as it could. But much of what I'm going to talk about today is a reflection on that. And I think one other point to make at this stage is that when you have a career moving forward, there are moments where you get a chance to reflect on a period of work and put a capstone on top of it in terms of some of your thinking and ideas. And I guess this book in a way was a reflection of that. So some of what I'm going to discuss today, I have talked about in the past, but sometimes you recycle greatest hits in a way to reinforce a bigger argument. And I think there's a kind of collection of arguments that come together in the text. Just start off with a few stories, really. Many of you will know places like this in London. The former power station on the front of the Pink Floyd album in the 1970s, Animals, great album. An area that was derelict for 40 years in London. It was formerly one of the power stations that was part of the grid within the city, closed in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And it's taken 40 years for it to be regenerated as part of a much bigger project in this part of London, right along the River Thames. Some of you may have seen it in just southwest of the centre. And it's a classic example of many of the things, of course, that are happening in this city. It's a great place to visit, by the way. I mean, I went there at Christmas. You can go up in an elevator, a big glass elevator, something out of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. You can go up to the top of one of these chimneys, which originally were built in the 1930s, and you get a wonderful view over London. It's a spectacular site. It's a spectacular regeneration project in every respect. But there's a couple of things about it I think are quite interesting to note. I mean, the money for this came from international sources, mainly from Malaysia and other sovereign wealth funds. The entire project involved, these chimneys look authentic, right, from the 1930s. And the person who designed the original power station was Gilbert Scott, who's the same architect who designed London's or Britain's phone boxes, like the same architect. He also did some Pancras Station and Bankside, which is now the Tate Modern. But all of those, in fact, are rebuilt. They were rebuilt by the company involved in the development. And what happened with this project was that it involved billions of pounds, up to £9 billion of investment. What happens with modern projects in London and what constitutes what we call a London model is that you can attract £9 billion of investment, but the type of development you get is of a particular form or type. In other words, somebody has to pay for that development, and it's only paid through in two ways, really. One is through extremely expensive retail, and the second one is extremely expensive real estate to purchase or to rent, actually to purchase in this case. Every time you add a regulation, in other words, if you tell the developer you must keep the original form and structure of that building, every time you add a regulation like that, which sounds good, that's what planners do, it adds to the cost. The cost is then recuperated in one way, and that is delivering less affordable housing and increasing the cost of the housing to remake the money to invest in the nice heritage that you've reinvested in. In other words, there's a real governance challenge here for planners, because the more that you try to restrict this type of growth model and development, the more you put regulatory costs onto a development. It's only paid in one way, and that's paid by not allowing the developer then to provide housing of an affordable level. In other words, they say it was so expensive to do this, we have to provide infrastructure and things that give us a return, and that just happens to be super expensive. It's part of a global phenomenon, of course. In the case of London, what we see here in these rather complex, apologies at the back, but what I'm trying to show in this, since 2014 up to just before COVID, there's a growing gap between what are called affordable house deliveries in London. In other words, the building of units that can be afforded, although we'll come back to that question later about what that is, and the developments happening in places that are curiously called unaffordable housing, which is a strange term, really, because somebody's purchasing that housing, but nonetheless it's very, very expensive. And you see a greater gap in London, despite all the efforts and all the extraordinary political capital around the debate around housing crisis, what we do about it. The crisis in London just gets bigger and bigger in terms of affordability, in terms of new delivery. That lack of new delivery longer term, of course, will only increase the gap probably even more, because there's less and less of it in the longer term. And this is some of the problematics that we have been looking at the same time in our project, which I'll talk about in a minute. This is by Danielle Sanderson, Nicola Livingston, two of my colleagues on the project. there is a lot of investment going into new housing in London, but it's actually, as Sarah and others have also highlighted in their work, Sarah Ozagol here, it's going into things like student accommodation. It's going into the building of something called build to rent. In other words, a little bit better than student accommodation, but actually exactly the same thing, which is basically you rent an apartment as an entire unit, as a professional person. So these are the sorts of housing that are now being constructed in London. You get some sense here that from the work we did by 2020, you get PBSA, the blue one here, which is purpose-built student accommodation, taking up something like half of all the investment around new apartments in the city. In other words, the market is pushing investment and development in one direction, which is that there's a lot of students, there's a lot of young professional people that can't buy because housing's unaffordable. And it's beginning to build units in its own image, which is we need more units for these people, as opposed to maybe building the types of housing that traditionally we as planners have said that you need as part of a sustainable community. For example, family housing, family infrastructure, welfare infrastructure. These sorts of things are going to one side because where the market investment is increasingly going is where, of course, there are the strongest returns. And those returns at the moment in terms of affordability are for students and for young professionals who can't afford a house. That has big implications, as we're going to see later, for regeneration projects, because what happens is in some places you see enormous developments happening, but in fact they're for a very, very narrow group of people, which has all sorts of implications for the places we're trying to build. One other quick introductory kind of slide is that I just wanted to point this out before I come back to some of the examples later. We did quite a lot of work in the book. There's a whole chapter on international investment into real estate and urban development. And it's just worth thinking about this, I think, comparatively with the Dutch case and with Amsterdam and other cities in the Netherlands, because yes, London's a global city. Yes, London has particular characteristics, but I still think there's quite a few parallels maybe one could draw and differences perhaps too, contrasts. But we've identified in the work, and we show this in the book, 4 different types of key investment capital into real estate. The rise of pension funds, of course. In the case of London, we identified about 18 billion, about 20 billion euros worth of assets just in the real estate sector and from pension funds. So huge investments coming in. Many of these are from international funds as well. One of the big funds investing in housing in London, I don't know if this is true here in the Netherlands, is the Canadian Teachers Pension Fund. I had a Canadian, I'm not making this up, I had a student in my class this year whose parents were retired teachers from Canada. And I was telling her that, of course, they're making the funds and they're making the money through London's real estate market for investing in it, of course, all sorts of interconnection. I think the second point is a key one, and perhaps one that has become more significant and yet less researched for curious reasons I can't quite understand, because global capitalism is in itself changing. The rise of new sovereign wealth funds is absolutely paramount to the developments that are happening in a city like London. I was reading in The Economist just last month that because of the Ukraine war, these countries such as Qatar, the Qatari Investment Authority, one of the biggest investors in London, Temasek, which is the Singaporean pension fund and state fund, which also is for pensions. Basically, what they were saying in The Economist was that petrodollars are going to suddenly flood the world market again. All these countries are absolutely overwhelmed with money, dollars. They don't know where to spend it. And they're looking for places to park it, whether it's Manchester City, Paris Saint-Germain, or football clubs or famous racehorses. But actually, it's investment in big international cities and property that's going to become, again, another boom potentially coming that way. Right? So I just think this is really important, because in some of the work we did on Chinese investment into London, it's a bit of an aside, but I'll just touch on it because it's useful here. We looked at the way in which what the Chinese government does is absolutely fundamental to investment into the London housing market. So if you're trying to understand the housing market in London and how it's regulated and governed, you can't just look at the London level. You can't just look at what the Mayor of London says this and the London plan says that, and that's where all the explanation can be found, or even maybe the national level, of course. But actually what we're seeing is that in terms of regulation, what happens in countries like Qatar or China, what those governments say those investment funds should do is shaping where that investment goes increasingly. In other words, the geopolitics of investment is much more upfront than it used to be. It was always there, right? American multinationals were American multinationals, obviously in the past. But what you've got now is that the Mayor of London, if he wants to attract investment, doesn't really talk to a company, you talk to the government of these countries. That's a difference in how we think about real estate investment and who the key actors are. Right? And I think a little bit under research. I don't know in the case of Amsterdam so much where these figures fit in. A couple of other things as well. In the London case and in the English case, you see the emergence of real estate investment trusts or property-specific funds with all kinds of tax advantages. So there's an attempt by the British government to increase the amount of institutional investment into real estate, partly to solve the housing crisis, right? Bringing money for housing. And so there are all sorts of tax benefits and so on if you can set yourself up as a legally registered investment trust, a real estate investment trust. And these are huge players within this market as well, as we'll see. And on top of that, you have a range of investors who don't really sort of property specific, they don't really fit into the institutional line, who are just families, right? The Agnelli family, who own Fiat and Ferrari and so on, are big investors through companies like Alma Kantar in London's real estate. So again, you've got another group of people who are, if you like, really are private companies. You don't even see their accounts necessarily. You don't know where the money's coming from. But that's another part of this mix. And then on top of that, you have what we call opportunist funds like BlackRock and others who are increasingly investing in real estate. I'll just throw one point to all of you. If you're a planner or a lawyer or a legal planner or whatever you might be, how on earth do you regulate a sector that's in such churn and with such powerful actors in such an enormous amount of activity? I just put that to us. So on the one hand, I'm not letting planners and developers and policymakers off the hooks. They help to facilitate this. But there are some enormous regulatory challenges around how on earth you try to connect these things up in a way that meets public policy objectives. Right? That's a challenge for all of you to think about. And I think it's a challenge for us as researchers, but also as teachers. Right? How do you teach students to work in that environment without scaring them, make it extremely positive? How do you do that? What do you do? How do you manage these wider processes? And just one other preamble thing before I come back to the specifics of the findings, and I'll probably finish by sort of 4-ish. One other thing we talk about in the book, and some work I've been doing for over a decade in the English context, just to complexify it. So the book is not just about housing, it's also about how infrastructure in the British context has become a global industry in itself. And of course, infrastructure in all cities has become probably the biggest investment opportunity that exists. And so one way in which capitalism is also changing is that in the last 20 years or so, we see the emergence of funds that exist only to provide infrastructure and sometimes services on behalf of the state. So there are companies like Innisfree, people have never heard of normally, who are key actors in Britain. They have 54 projects. They have over £18 billion worth of welfare assets within the British welfare state. They provide things like hospital buildings, new roads, any type of infrastructure you can think of. Even where I live, companies like this provide the street lights, right? They're provided by private companies, not by the state that we traditionally think is providing these things. It's not. And so you've got this extraordinary growth of another set of players out there, private finance actors who are financing welfare infrastructure, part of which is housing, but actually a lot of it is about much more than just housing. So what I'll do is to reflect on the work that Tuna's already mentioned, the WIG project. We also involved people, Patrick Le Galley and others in Paris and Sciences Po. We had this project between the 3 cities, London, Paris, Amsterdam, and we drew on Patrick's work with Tommaso Vitale around what is governed in cities. A very basic question, but actually the most basic questions, I think, generate the most interesting answers in life in general, actually. And Le Galley and Vitales argue that there are 3 things we should look at. What is governed? Who's governing? Who governs when nobody governs? Actually, I'll come back to that point later. It's a very, very interesting question about the informalities that this system creates. But methodologically, what we did in the project is develop an in-depth, powerful, deep dive description of what's going on in these three cities. Rather than coming at it with a much stronger theoretical lens, of course, we have conceptual writings on financialization of the city, all this kind of stuff, but we wanted to get to some deep dive descriptions. In other words, if you can take the case of London, who is governing is a really interesting question to ask yourself and to try to research. It's a fiendishly complicated question to answer, as we'll see, but I think that's part of the answer. It is complicated, and that's why I think there's a very powerful question. And so what we argue in the book, and I'll put the arguments up there straight away, and then I'll just explain them one by one, is that we argue in the book that you see a London model of growth-led development, and we describe that. There are many different definitions of a model we don't want to get too into in the book, and come back on that later, I think. But we see it as the emergence of a set of ideas that shape development practices and regulation in the city. It's a set of ideas, it's a way of thinking about what planning, what development governance should be about. It's part of a wider shift in how cities and societies are governed, of course. And we introduce this term in the book that we're moving away from traditional forms of public-private partnership to the rise of what we call the para-state, right? A set of agencies and organizations delivering services and infrastructure on behalf of the state, but not of the state. We see the emergence of companies like G4S, for example, the global security company, that exists entirely to do things that the state used to do. Right, so you go to Schiphol Airport and the people doing the security checks for G4S, I think. You look at some of the business improvement districts in many cities, countries like Britain, they're also policed by private actors, private corporations. If you think about who's delivering much of the infrastructure around place building in cities, it's private companies acting on behalf of the state or doing things the state used to do. So it's part of the agendas that we're trying to look at in the book are what's left to the state, by the way. What is it that the state still does? It's a very interesting question because we think it's not quite what instinctively we would say. Like many people instinctively would say it's all about the mayor, it's all about the local city authority. Increasingly, those organizations are just shells and they're just getting others to do things for them. We argue that this has huge implications for what planners do. Planners themselves, by the way, in the English context, are being privatized. Like much of the, as we'll see later, master planning process in the English system is written by private companies, by private agencies, by big legal firms. But they're supposed to be planning for all of us. They're supposed to be planning for places. But I thought that was a public activity. Increasingly, it's not. It's done by private experts. Increasingly, as students, I think more of our students now go to get jobs in private consultancy than they do in public sector in England. I don't know if that's true here, probably not here. There's some great, interesting stuff by the United Nations. I've never really seen anyone else refer to it, and I hope I'm not making it up because I seem to be the only person that ever found it. There was some very interesting work by the United Nations, the Committee on Trade and Development, where they argued that we all have a right to regulate the places we live in. I thought it was quite an interesting idea. So we play about with that in the book as well. And we certainly had that as a key framing bandwidth project with Tuna and Patrick, that what does a right to regulate look like? Who has the right to regulate? What does that mean? Is that a human right? And I think it probably is, actually, to have some say over how you're regulated. It's not quite as sexy as some of the other human rights we talk about, but I think it's fundamental to how we live our lives. And again, just to preempt a lot in the book, I'm not going to go through these in detail, but these are the sorts of underpinnings that, sorry, something flashed up. Underpinnings that we use in the book. So we argue this London model is the epitome of a growth-centered development planning program. So the whole purpose is you capture private expertise, finance, generate surpluses, and use those for public gain. It's very much the idea you can have your cake and eat it, right? As we know, public betterment has been a big part of planning since the Second World War, but this is that, if you like, on steroids, or absolutely super turbocharged into an agenda. In other words, what we can do is cut the public sector, replace it by generating growth and capturing surpluses for the public sector. Right? Simple thing. Secondly, as I mentioned, the privatization of governance, the rise of the para-state. I'll be coming back to that later. A third element, and again, Tuna's work on this, I think, was formative in earlier research that she and others did, around governing through detail. So the rise of new contractual spaces as an absolute underpinning of how societies, how cities are now governed. Increasingly, you go and talk to a lawyer rather than a politician if you want an outcome. And many of the community groups we deal with in London know that, work like that. And there's a whole process of what's called judicialisation going on. In other words, you go to the judiciary before you bother with the lawyer. Well, why would you talk to a politician when they've outsourced everything to private companies, sometimes under 25 or 30-year agreements? Why would you do that? You go and talk to the lawyers. They might be able to help you unpick some of those contracts. They can look at some of the technical elements of those contractual spaces. That's a real change in how we think about governance, I think, when we argue in the book. It's elite-led, it's very expensive. We're very, very into, and I'm very interested in what some of the Amsterdam work is showing on some of this. The work of Katharina Pistel on the codes of capital that shape global capitalism, and the way in which she writes about the growth of private law facilitating urban projects. In other words, the legal frames that accountants and lawyers and consultants use that are not state laws necessarily, but are adopted as public policy practice, but they're private law. In other words, these sectors decide what those legal framings are and professional practices. They then become public policy. In the case of London, that is extreme. It seems as I'll show you in a minute. So in the book, and I'm not going to talk about all of these things, don't worry, but we talk about strategic planning, housing, major infrastructure, and large-scale projects. What I'm going to do in this is briefly, I want to say something about continuity and change, a little bit of background to the London context. I think it's really, really significant. Then I'll talk about the power state, and then I'll finish off with some examples of some projects, and then we'll be done. Just say one thing about this, because you know, when I was a schoolboy in the 1980s in London, I was taught in my geography classes that London had no future, nor did Amsterdam for that matter, nor did Paris. Right, their populations are falling. There'd been some people were talking about counter-urbanisation. I did whole lecture, even as an undergraduate in London in the early 90s, we had whole lectures on counter-urbanisation, people leaving the city. The idea that the future was big cities was not the zeitgeist of the time. And I think we need to keep this in mind when we think a little bit about futures, because things that seem an absolute certainty at one moment in your life, 30 years later, you look back and people were saying things like, well, the future is all places like Venlo or Reading or Stevenage in England, these very small scale places, because it's post-Fordist. We're moving into a post-Fordist future. The small will be the transformative. Big cities have had their day. I used to go to these lectures all the time about that. All those people were wrong. Actually, they're completely wrong. I mean, let's just be honest about it. I won't give any names, some academics that I heard from in the early 90s, but they were pretty wrong. It was a reasonable supposition, to be fair, but they got it wrong. So be careful when people say that the future is going to be just the big metropolitan cities. There's no possibility that things could go wrong. I mean, I think COVID might have taught us something else, which I'll come to at the very end. Anyway, the standard narrative about London is it went from this imperial centre to a city that had declined, particularly in the 1940s, 50s, 60s onwards. The famous book by Yates, centre-right academic from the US, who argued that big cities were ungovernable. They had their day, they were finished, New York and London, because they were too big to enable people to feel a sense of connection, but they were too small to really be good strategic planners for development. And so people like Yates said that they were finished, but ungovernable. And what's happened is the standard narrative is a transformation into this triumphant world city, key role played by elected mayors and the commodification of built environments, tapping into expertise, resources and capacities of actors beyond the state and beyond the nation state. This is the standard narrative, what we call the simple story in the book. And there's some truth, of course, in this. So one of the things we tried to do was to do some proper historical research around some of the key framings and documents. There's an absolutely pivotal book called London World City, published by PricewaterhouseCoopers, but actually including all the big players in London in the mid-1990s that argued for this shift in thinking about how development should happen, really tried to reorient how the city should think about growth and development, of course, within a bigger context as well. Part of a wider academic movement, people like Glaser and others writing about Triumph of the City, you know very well. If you want to read a bizarre book, I mean, there's somebody called Boris Johnson, used to be Mayor of London and unfortunately became this wonderful Prime Minister. Have a look at that absolutely extraordinary book, The Greatest City on Earth, if you want to read something which is a bombastic narrative about a world-centered growth. It's a very interesting document. I get the students to read it and they love it. But these are the kinds of continuities in London's planning debates I think are really interesting. And I'm sure I know that they relate very strongly to the Randstad and other places here. So on the one hand, we came across quite a lot of historical discussions going back to the 1920s or further about London as being too powerful vis-a-vis the rest of the country, of course, a bit like Amsterdam and other things. But I think some fundamental questions. How strategic should London's governance be? Should it be governed as one place? Or should it be governed as one space with multiple interconnected places? And these tensions, I mean, I think the tensions were good, possibly creative, of course, have been fundamental in shaping what has happened over the last 30 years in London, because they're still being argued over, still being resolved. What we've seen, in effect, is London being portrayed increasingly as one space and one place, actually, as well for development, downplaying the role of the places within London and the differences across the city. Some people have called that a fallacy of composition. You make one London as a city. I see this in a lot of academic papers. People will say things like, London thought this, or Amsterdam thinks that. Well, who in Amsterdam and London? It's a very specific question, right? I mean, there are many Londons, I would argue, but these things still get batted around. But the planning system has been quite static. We have boroughs in London, I'll come to in a second. The planning system remains reliant on developers, who are often understood as quite difficult to regulate. In these days of the coronation celebrations at home, we can think about this. The crown, in other words, the king and the church and 5 aristocratic families have a collective wealth of £22 billion worth of land assets still in London. So those historical ties are still there. The Duke of Westminster was the richest man in England without ever having worked a day in his life, simply by the fact that his family owns Mayfair. The Grosvenor estate is one of those. They're all Norman families as well, by the way. They all came over with William the Conqueror. They're the same people, De Walden, for example. It's really interesting. Yeah, that's a different question. It's a big city, and we're talking about 40 kilometres across by about 25. It's a huge area, and these boroughs are if we looked at the debate around setting these borough boundaries in the 1960s, 1965, to give you some idea though, there are boroughs now like Croydon that have populations getting on for 400,000 in one local authority area. The population of London keeps growing, well over 9 million. So some of these are becoming super boroughs, right? I don't know how that relates to the population of Amsterdam. It's about half, isn't it? I mean, population around here is about what, 1,800,000? You know, so one borough out of 32 is getting to the level of being half the size of Amsterdam. In other words, it's a complex, diverse space, of course, in governance terms as well, potentially, perhaps not in reality. And one other thing historically is that it has always been difficult to regulate property developers and the property sector in London. I don't know how, again, that relates to the Amsterdam case, and we could talk a little bit about that historically, but wonderful writing in the 1960s about the property boom, people like Oliver Marriott and others, about how the developers basically just did what they wanted. They just ignored the planning system. I mean, at the time, you were not allowed to build a building in London higher than a London Fire Brigade ladder. But that's a bit higher than that, right? And it was built in the 1960s simply through effectively corruption networks and deals made with certain politicians. There's nothing new about some of these things. I just put that forward as well. But there have been major changes too. So we see the shift about London's role as a driving force. In other words, with the rise of neoliberalism, what you see is that governments in the UK and elsewhere in Europe back their winners. They back the areas that they think are going to be most successful, and they hope the growth trickles down to the rest of the country. And this narrative is very, very powerful, of course. And so the agenda in London has gone from managing decline, 1960s, 50s, to managing growth. How do you manage the expansion of the city as a place for investment, development, and so on? I mentioned the fallacy of composition. Peter Marcuse's work on this, late Peter Marcuse, was superb about the idea of people use terms like London PLC as those one incorporated business. that everybody in London benefits or does not benefit from development, that everybody in London works together. And this is nonsense, of course, as we'll see later, but it's a very powerful narrative that the world city. People in Britain often talk about UK PLC, as in a public limited company, like it's a company. It's not a company in any way, shape or form, but it's used in those terms. It's just worth, by the way, I mean, again, I'd be very interested in the Amsterdam case. If you go back to the 1970s, I looked at the Greater London Development Plan of 1976. It does not mention developers, investors, or investment once. Okay, it's not in PDF. Maybe that's just me not finding it. But my skills have rather been lost over the years. But it doesn't mention them. It talks about housing simply as an activity by the state in terms of building housing. It's a plan without a market. It never mentions the market once. I just think it's interesting. Right? I think it's a historical bit to the book, but I think there's a paper to be written in that and some other work to be done on whatever happened. What was the market in the past? What were you talking about in terms of the market? There were developers, house builders, but why are they not mentioned as part of? And the reason was because, of course, public policy saw itself as being at the vanguard of delivering new infrastructure and housing, a very different model to what we have now. And of course, London's population, as with many cities, was purposefully reduced by public policy from the end of the Second World War to the mid-1980s. So again, imagine my geography classes were happening there, and everybody was saying, oh, it's got no future, just carry on like that, and it will be the size of Reading by the year 2025. Of course, it hasn't. Its population and growth have rapidly changed. One other thing about London, which I think is a bit surprising, despite all of the developments I'm going to mention later, is that outer London has become a more suburban city. Right, so we see a suburbanization of population within the city. Again, this is interesting, I think, in terms of the development geography. What's happening in simple terms is people are being priced out of the centre and they're moving into places which are in the suburbs, usually quite poor quality housing, and they're living in multiple occupants. In other words, they're living in overcrowded housing in many boroughs. One of the interviewees we interviewed in an outer London borough said to us in an interview, we've got a wonderful policy. It's do not build and they will come. In other words, people just moving into the borough, they've got no space to build anything else. And so you just get overcrowding there. But you are seeing suburbanization as people desperately look for somewhere to live. Don't say much about the experience of living in the city in this talk, but I mean, just keep that in mind perhaps as a thought for questions. Right, second aspect, I just go into a bit more detail about the notion of the para-state, and there's an interesting research agenda here. We're again very interested in what this can mean comparatively. So we argue that governance research needs to examine the para-state, or the suite of agencies that govern alongside, on behalf of, or in place of state institutions. Three elements to that. So again, break this down a little bit more. One is what we call the rise of the procurement state. Secondly, governance by contract I mentioned earlier. And thirdly, the institutionalization of market dependence and a growth agenda. So let's start with the first one of those, the rise of procurement. In other words, what we mean by procurement is getting actors beyond the state to deliver a service or to deliver a product, and then you manage them indirectly through a contract. That's really how governance increasingly works, of course. It's a normative project, we argue, because the assumption is that you get better outcomes if you move governance away from old-fashioned vertical integration and decenter it and fracture it and fragment it. And it's basically a set of what we call in the book indirect arrangements. And so what happens is increasingly public policy is conducted in this way. Somebody comes up with a demand. They go to a politician. The politician tries to identify a mechanism of procurement through which they can, almost like a puppet master with a puppet, they try to bring people together to deliver that public policy outcome through clever contracts, through smart procurement, through, guess what, hiring other private companies, by the way, to help you with procurement. Thinking about how you might develop markets of regulation. In other words, you might bring in people like PricewaterhouseCoopers, or you might bring about Accenture or somebody else to help you govern, because increasingly you're governing through procurement. And where do you find the expertise on procurement? Oh, it just happens to be in the private sector as well. So you begin to get this extraordinary layering, if you like, of procurement. I'll just give you some idea. This was just before COVID. So the figures would have changed. I haven't bothered to update them. But we found through UK Treasury data, and this includes transfers between departments, but to give you some idea of the scale here, nearly £300 billion worth of procurement goes on every year within the British state up to 2020. To give you some idea of that, so that means that through the state, there are one way or another into procurers, in other words, people at the end of that, who are normally private companies, sometimes charities, right, or social actors, but still. That's a third of public spending. It's more than a third of all public spending. This is extraordinary, really. This is a complete change in how we still imagine that governments, you pay them taxes, they spend it, and you have an outcome. Or maybe don't, but I did anyway. But the scale of this, and this was before COVID, right? So we might expect, and I'm sure we would have expected, an enormous amount of money to pour into other private companies through procurement to deliver COVID responses. So vast amount of expenditure goes that way. Just in London, I mean, the latest figures I could find, they weren't great, I have to say, but something like £13 billion is being spent by boroughs alone on contracts. That doesn't include the London level either. It's very hard to find out where the money goes. Around about a third of that, we think, or more, was spent on real estate, on buildings. At the same time, what you have in the London context, and this is part of the wider picture, which I haven't mentioned, is a great social experiment, because this is where I think we are a little bit different to the Netherlands. It's an amazing experiment going on. So this shows, these figures here show the amount of money that local authorities have to spend, and it's gone down by, in some parts of London, about 65% over that 10-year period after the global financial crisis, when there was a movement towards austerity. Local government funds have been literally decimated, almost been down by 65%, at the same time as demands have gone up. The public policy agenda from central government is, of course, if you have this gap between the spending and the amount you're getting, why don't you encourage more development and capture some of the financial value from developments to fill the gap? In other words, if you need a new school, you need a new clinic or a hospital building, why don't you encourage a private company to build more housing, make money, capture some of the value, and then it begins to fill this finance gap that has been deliberately created to encourage that. Right, so this is a political project or an agenda which is trying to push local planners into being more forced entrepreneurialism, if that term exists. Be an entrepreneur, but you have to be, because your funds are being cut otherwise. Right? There's no other funding that you can have. And the size of this, we looked at a lot of work. So what's happening is that the Mayor of London, the boroughs, increasingly are talking about good procurement as good governance. In other words, writing good contracts, smart procurement. This is the Greater London Authority's 6 principles of procurement: enhancing social value, encouraging equality, fair employment. I'm not saying necessarily there's an interesting issue about the outcomes in this, which I'll touch on in a minute, but it's an indirect form of governance. It's basically saying what we do is govern through the actions of others, through these kinds of principles. So it's kind of what people like David Levi Ford call a kind of form of indirect democracy, but it influences public policy because private expertise and capacities open up options for policymakers. You can suddenly say, okay, well, G4S exists. Why don't we give them something to do? I mean, it's as simple as that. There's a capacity there that we can use. Other private companies exist. Let's use them to help us build new welfare systems. Let's help them to build new infrastructure. And so the existence, for example, of a private security industry enables the rolling out of a wider security procurement program because they exist. And some people have argued, like Levi Ford and others, that we're now in an era of regulatory capitalism. In other words, companies make enormous amounts of money by doing this. They make more money in a more safe way than they would if they were doing old-fashioned things like building things, making things, old-fashioned things like being in an industry where there are competitors. This is a wonderful way of capturing money in a way that is actually quite tied in to the state, an absolutely wonderful source of money, of course. I'll just say one other thing. I mean, in the English case, not the case in places like France, but in the English case, the planners, the developers and others also write the master plans on behalf of local government. Local governments now increasingly just give their assent to them or support, but they're written by the developers. They're written by the development agencies. And that again, surprise, surprise, the developments then reflect what they think should be done. So governance through contract, I already said a few things. I just want to boil them down to one thing. Tuna's work on this, I think, is superb. In the Netherlands context and Brazil, and in England as well, Rob Atkinson. But I think it's really interesting. So they've got a lot of interviews with planners and developers and with planners and public actors. And we ask them, how do you take a public demand for some, I don't know, more affordable housing, more democracy, more engagement? How do you convert that into a contract with all these actors? How do you do that? What's the mechanism by which you do it? And of course, the problem is that contracts are a very transactional thing, and they're a very inflexible thing. They're basically setting up a contract with a developer, someone to do it for you, and it's a transaction. The trouble is that, of course, demands, political demands, social needs, environmental demands, as we saw in the protest downstairs today, they change. They shift, they move around. How then do you make contracts put together in a way that enables politicians to also change them without undermining their effectiveness, without undermining their appeal to those who are being contracted? No one's got many answers. It's a very difficult question to answer, but increasingly that's what governing is, right, given this wider context and what planning is. And so I looked at, some of you may have seen this before, a few years back I did some work on basic stuff like I think it was 302-page contract that exists to run a train line in southeast London where I live. And you try to work out, well, how much do I actually pay? That is the mechanism through which that's agreed. A couple of other things I found in that contract, by the way, just this is an aside. One was that there's something called revenue support. So if the amount of passengers falls, the state will recompense the private company anyway. In other words, there's no risk, no jeopardy. The second thing, and this was great, because I gave this talk to some I shouldn't say this, but to some senior civil servants, and I said that in this contract somewhere it said if there is a strike, the state will pay the private company any loss it might make. I said this at this meeting, and one of the civil servants said, "Oh, Mike, strikes are so yesterday's issue." There's been a year of strikes, and one of the issues about that strike is that the train companies get the money anyway from the state. Anyway, so these are the types of things that are being put in place. And of course, think about the resources involved in writing these contracts. They're huge amounts of money. It costs, some people estimate that writing the contracts for the London Underground, which was privatised briefly and then collapsed because it was a disaster, cost more than £750 million just writing the contract. Right? So somebody is making enormous sums of capital through that whole process. They would argue to make it more efficient. I mean, we can argue against that. I mean, again, an example I gave a few years back, there was a big debate over London's fire engines because these are provided under private finance agreements. They're not really owned by the state, they're owned by private companies. One of these companies went bust. There was a genuine debate in the English High Court about whether the fire engines should be sold to pay off the debt of the company, because of course the fire engines are provided by a private company. So if you're using their stuff, what happens if the private company goes bankrupt? Is it a public or a private asset? Huge legal argument. Luckily, I think the High Court said it was a public asset and that the company couldn't do that. But still, it was a bit of a jeopardy and a bit of a vulnerability. One other thing we tried to do, and I think we did it quite unsuccessfully in the book, I'd be very interested in others' insight. One other aspect of this is that there are an extraordinary number of private experts involved and private organisations in governing and making decisions about governance, not just in delivery, but in governing. So we try to map all, for example, of the chartered institutes that are royally prescribed in the English case, involved in property development. And so organisations here like CHIPFA, whatever it is, the ones who are professional, yeah, this one here. So there's a chartered procurement and supply professional. So if you have that accreditation, it gives you the power to do that. If you have the accreditation to be a chartered surveyor, it gives you enormous power to do things. But these organisations in themselves, including the RTPI, like the planning ones, help to write public policy. They actually drive it. And so a lot of the work we've been doing touches on organisations like the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors in England, but then, of course, a global organisation. Their red book on what is a good valuation around property development is fundamental to international real estate. And yet it's written by people that are not in any way accountable to politicians. It's written by an organisation which is a private organisation, delivering private projects, private norms, expectations, and other things. We've been looking at some of that in London. It's very interesting because in some recent legal arguments in England about the planning system, what's happened is that the judges turn to the planning authorities and they say, could you please get these organisations to rewrite the valuations? Because they're the ones that are used in the planning system. In other words, if you want to change the planning system, ask RICS and others to change their rules, and that will be a change in the planning system because we rely on these organisations to set the regulations. That is, again, a real change, I think. I mean, they're hugely significant. By the way, their office, they're a really interesting organisation, actually, and they're very open to interview and talk to if anyone's interested. But their main office is in Parliament Square. This is some idea of the power thing in England, literally opposite. And their original history was that the chartered surveyors helped the rail industry in the 19th century. So they were the people who built, effectively managed the governance of the railways, which made them such a powerful organisation. But they have 25,000, I think it is, global members and other things. So onto housing, I'm just going to touch on this to finish off, and I'll give you some examples. A few points you want to bring out from the book. Growth led, I've talked a lot about that. It legitimates this idea of the more expensive a development, the higher return potentially, and the more surplus you can capture. Right? So there's an incentive to promote big projects, a bias towards major projects. We touch on this. I don't think we did anywhere near enough work on this. I think Tuna would agree on the informal or dark side of this process as well. So what we argue in the book is that this this program of governing reinforces the role of backroom negotiations or informality. Others will go much further. We don't have any evidence for this. People like Transparency International see London's property market as one that is fundamentally built around forms of corruption, for example. We don't have any evidence. I couldn't find any. I mean, I didn't really want to send my researchers into that context, if I'm honest. But what I think it does do, think about people like Francesco Chiardelli, other people at the moment, writing some great work around the dark side of planning. The idea that, in fact, what you should do is you have better outcomes if you keep public discussions out of the public sector. In other words, if you allow procurement processes to work by enabling people to negotiate behind the scenes, the public sector gets a better deal, is the argument. In other words, the more you know, the worse off you are. Ignorance is good policy because it enables the people who are negotiating some of these things to get a better outcome. That's a very powerful narrative, I think. Let me touch on some examples to finish with some nice pictures. So the number of examples we look at through the book and elsewhere. We'll also do some extra work around the Wembley Stadium development, Northwest London. I'll give this as an example for many different reasons, partly because this was an area that was traditionally a place of quite low value land use around an old stadium in this part of London. I'll give you some pictures in a minute. If you look back at plans, and again, I think about this in the Netherlands context, look back at plans from the early 2000s, where there were huge discussions around building sustainable communities. In other words, creating places that were mixed, balanced, places where we have a mix of housing, mix of activities. That was European policy as well. They don't have a competence of the European Union for housing. They did talk a lot about sustainable community planning. Whatever happened to that, though? It's a quite interesting question, right? Because I mean, where Wembley is, there's been a lot of investment in the underground, and it's up in Northwest London, so it's on the edge of the centre. You can get into the centre within about 20 minutes, depending on which bit of the centre you're going to, of course, in London, but clearly it's pretty well connected. But the project that I look at in some work I've been doing subsequent to the book, and the next thing that we're doing is it shifted from being a sustainable community to really representing the image of the market. And what we talk about in this book is the way in which a Canadian company originally, but no longer, called Quintain, bought much of the land around the redevelopment area in the early 2000s. They then were part of a commissioning process around the work of Richard Rogers, late Richard Rogers and his firm, who wrote a master plan for the area, a huge project that was promoted and imagined. That was then updated in 2010. And what I've been doing is trying to go through those periods in the research. Quite interesting to look at how it becomes more and more this type of mass high-rise development. It is an extraordinary place to visit. I don't know if any of you have been to Wembley in the last 2, 3, 4 years, but it is an unbelievable urban environment. It's like, it is some cliche, something out of Blade Runner. I mean, it is, right, in that sense. It really is an extraordinary landscape. And originally it was part of the British Empire Games, 1920s, stadium was built. Huge efforts have been made to bring about this development, a huge map. And looking in the research at the different money going in, the local authority has tried, the Brent local authority, the council, have tried to keep some control over it by looking into the paper that I'm just doing at the moment at how difficult it is to control these flows of investment into a place like that. Because companies like Quintain, in writing these master plans, are able to build environments like this in the image that really most reflects the highest return, of course, for them, and where the money's coming from, which increasingly is from pension funds and other places. And so what's fascinating about this development, and I can't go into too much detail here, just a few points really. Once private actors become involved in this way, it becomes a commodified site, literally. And Quintain, for example, in 2016, were able to raise 800 billion euros from the Canadian Teachers Pension Fund, banks, Wells Fargo and others to update and upgrade the development. And in ways that were never envisaged in 2004 too, it is now the largest site of student housing and build-to-rent housing I mentioned at the beginning in London, and probably, I think Sarah's research shows, probably in Europe as a site. We're talking about well over 6,000 build-to-rent homes being constructed there. Huge developments. I can't explain the scale of these developments if you get to go to them, but by Unite Students, for example, another company which is another big investor in student housing. But why is that? I mean, the thing is, in a way, public planners have lost control of the project. Early visions kind of disappeared. Students usually stay in their places for 1 year, maybe 2. The average rent cycle in a build-to-rent apartment in that area is just 23 months. So you've got this extraordinary churn of people. That's not what the Sustainable Communities Plan originally said this place was going to be. That's the complete opposite. It said it was going to be a place that was a cohesive, coherent community. But it clearly is different. I'm not saying necessarily worse or better in a normative sense, just different to what was ever imagined. And it makes you think about what can planning do, really. It's not meeting local needs in any sense. In fact, it's making them worse. I did a lot of work around the Olympic site in Stratford. I just want to touch on some of that as well. As I looked at some of the debates around procurement and delivery, when I've tried to find things out about that project, and this is now typical in London and maybe typical here too, you get this kind of response, right? Things blacked out. So this was looking at some of the contracts around that development, who was paying the money, where was it going? Anything relating to money through projects, even if it's coming from public sources, is redacted, not allowed to see it. Now, I queried this and I was told that, well, it's good that you can't see it, because if you could see it as a citizen, that negotiation would not work so well, and the private sector would probably not, well, the public sector would not get such a good deal. In other words, I was told by the UK Information Commissioner that the public interest is the right not to know how the money's spent. The less you know, the better the outcome. And if we were to shine a light on that as researchers, then the negotiation might then not be quite so good. They use the word, it might prejudice that process. I found this extraordinary, actually, I have to say. I mean, and the idea that the commercial interests were interchangeable with the public. In other words, these negotiations were not things you should see, they were the things behind. Quite extraordinary. I think that image is a very powerful one, which I always show. And final example, just touch on was Centrepoint I mentioned earlier. I'm going to go very, very quickly. It's an example of this company, Alma Cantor, this new family type of investor into London's real estate market, coming in and taking prestigious projects and going back to that building built in the 1960s that have become empty. It was mainly offices that have become empty. It's on the London Crossrail, the new regional rail line that's been opened up through central London, a prime real estate site. And I looked at the debates, and also others are involved. By the way, some of the landed estates I mentioned earlier have their own property development arms. Frogmore Estates, for example, one of these landed estate aristocratic families are also really important here. And I looked at the debate around that. So there's huge developments going on, well, being redone, not necessarily going up. And I looked at the numbers, and it's quite useful, I think. So a payment of what, about €1 million was given to the local authority as surplus. In other words, they were given planning permission, and as part of that planning permission, the developer, Alma Cantor and others said, we'll give you €1 million for the welfare state, for welfare projects. You might think that's quite good, actually, in a way, right? But when you start looking at the numbers, I mean, the price of a one-bedroom apartment, and it was 1.8. It's not all profit, obviously. It's a huge amount of money to redo, but still, one duplex apartment at the top was going for £55 million. 131 units. So think about the flows of money coming through there. Only 13 of which were defined as affordable, and these ones at the bottom here, and they were the smaller ones mainly, and they were at 80% of the market rate. So affordable to whom is impressive. But this is exactly the type of things that's happening in big projects. I think going into the numbers is quite a good way of doing it. What happens when things go bust? Market crises quickly lead to welfare crises when there's a market downturn. We've got the energy crisis, we've got limits on growth, huge increase in costs in construction going on. So some of these things in the model are beginning to dissipate. And a couple of slides to finish off. One thing that's interesting in some research I've been doing more recently is a few things coming out of this, right? So the models have actually started to, around privatisation, public-private partnership and so on, have started to meet a lot of resistance. And I think it's an interesting research agenda here, because I've been told that increasingly these projects are so lacking in flexibility, are so critiqued, that public actors are actually beginning to try to take things back in-house. That in other words, they're trying not to do procurement, they're trying to move away. And so I've been told in some interviews recently that public-private partnership is dead in Europe. Sort of dramatic statements. I'm not sure that's true in the English case, but it may be in other parts of Europe, where increasingly what we're seeing are the things here at the bottom. So you're seeing what Andy Cumbers and others have called the remunicipalization of services, where a lot of local authorities and governments are realizing that things are better done in integrated ways, and they're beginning to remunicipalize things that were privatized. And that is a trend. Places even in Britain, like Wales, have started to remunicipalize certain things. There is a wider question, by the way, though, and I'm looking at as well at the moment, about handing back things from the private sector to the public. Right? In the case of England, some of the contracts around privatization last for 30 to 40 years. Some of those are beginning to end. What happens in the health sector, for example, when you suddenly re-inherit buildings that have been run by a private company for 40 years? How do you re-inherit that infrastructure? How do you reconnect things? What about liabilities? What about construction costs? What about everything else? Right? So a lot of interesting things out there. And finally, just to say, people are a part of this. So one other thing that's been a part of this is a very, very strong civil society resistance. I don't say much about that in the book, but there's a chapter on it. Some great campaigns I was sort of involved with in South East London, tackling some of these sorts of things. So what's left for the state to do? Interesting question to discuss, perhaps. What should the role of other actors be in policy development? It's not necessarily a bad thing. Things I've been discussing, maybe. Who's governing? And how, though, I think, and I'll finish off, I had to mention Brexit, how do you finish off in a context where things require maybe arguably quite integrated responses? How do you do that in a context of this sort of procurement model I've been talking about governing? How do you deal with the climate emergency when the capacities and levers you have increasingly been hollowed out? And maybe you just become one enormous procurer. Maybe that's a way of doing it. But it's an interesting question in there. And other shocks, this system, of course, COVID, and in the English case, Brexit, geopolitical shocks, or Ukraine being another shock, can shake models up that you think look very, very certain. Okay, thank you for indulging me a little bit over time, but it's the
So maybe what we just do, collect some questions, because we have time enough actually to continue with some Q&A.
Thanks for the talk. My name is Lynn Boterman. I'm associate professor in geography. And I was wondering, and this might sound like an old question, but what's the politics of this? I mean, obviously, we talk about politics in the civil government, but there's also, I mean, people that have been legally and also representation in charge of allowing this to happen, right? So, what is the local, maybe also the national politics of this, and how is it possible that this could happen? How could it see through the fingers? You know, the people that are in charge and you know that wrote to sort of the Greater London Development Plan in '60s that don't mention the market at all. Apparently they were thinking that they were in charge still, right? So at some point this must have shifted. So I'm curious if you can sort of this.
We'll collect some other questions.
Yeah, maybe let's collect a couple of more.
Yeah, I'm Claudius van Oldersen. I'm an assistant professor from Tilburg University, actually, in legal theory. So I'm a bit of an odd man out here. But you put some very thorny challenges to lawyers. So I felt like, yeah. Also a bit put on the spot because I must say that I have no direct answer to your question. But I also thought you mentioned also law as how is it regulated and how do we keep on regulating it? Yeah, but law can also be a space for resistance, right? Just like you also noted in your book that you can, how did you phrase it? You turn institutions of the parastate against each other through legal challenges.
Yes.
And I was thinking, what do you think about that? Because that might be, law is quite inflexible. So lawyers will, apart from the state, apart from private companies, make a decision, and that will influence further the deliberation. I reckon. So, do you think that this strategy is viable, or does it lead to other problems of creating a ruling class of judges instead of private companies, instead of state companies? So, I wonder what you think about the legal position of lawyers in this.
Maybe one more, and then Michiel.
I'm Michiel, also from Tilburg Law School, but totally not a lawyer. Thank you for the very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. And now I have a question about the flexibility of contracts, because I've done some research in New York, Amsterdam, and Hamburg on contracts as well. And especially in Amsterdam, especially in Hamburg, you can see when citizens mobilize, these contracts can be opened up and can be negotiated, and often the municipality has to step in also, sometimes also financially. And in Hamburg, you even have a few cases that municipality bought back property from developers because people were rising in the streets. But I don't think contracts can only be transactional, but they can also be relational. And especially in these huge projects that take 10 years, a lot of things are changing. So the developers and the investors are also negotiating things informally. So I was just wondering whether contracts are really transactional or are they more relational?
Yeah, let's maybe continue like this, and then we take the next round of questions.
Okay, yeah. Well, thank you for the comments and questions. I mean, I just maybe start off with the political projects. Yeah, I think it's a very reasonable point, because actually when I think about it, I mean, it wasn't so much about the politicians in here, partly because I think I tried to argue in the book that in some ways some of the the normal thinking about politicians being significant is maybe a little bit overblown in this context, because increasingly they've hollowed out the capacity to have an influence, certainly at the local level. But at the bigger level, of course, political projects are absolutely fundamental. I think perhaps there's two different elements to that. One is that there's a lot of writing about the rise of regulatory capitalism, or the idea that there's huge amounts of money to be made in governing. And there's some recent research on companies like McKinsey's and others who are themselves part of the governance infrastructure of an increasingly globalized world. And in Catalina Pistor's work, she talks at length about the role of international legal frameworks in enabling all forms of investment, all forms of development. Every aspect of the development process, she argues, being a good lawyer, is down to the law. And it's down to the ways in which these legal frameworks have become internationalized. So on the one hand, there is a political project of globalization, if you like, within the private. What's happening to the private sector? What's happening to those who help to regulate private activity and private law from the private sectors? That's one group. On the public side, you have actors who, I mean, I didn't want to use the word neoliberalism, although one could argue that this is a part of I think it's more complicated than just neoliberalism. But what you have is an agenda which is arguing, firstly, in the case of England, certainly, that consistently governments argue that the state cannot do things through a vertical integrated model, that it is flawed, that a bureaucratic structure is one that is inefficient. And so the role of the state is to tap into the resources, expertise of others in order to deliver public programs. That is a model that has been reinforced since global financial crisis through government austerity programs. There's a political project around that. But it's also, I think, that these things go hand in hand, though, because it seems to me that it's the presence of private expertise and private sector actors who can deliver something for you that enables public actors to increasingly give that over, if you like, in terms of what they do to others. So I'll give you the example of planning. Gradually, the planning system in England has become privatized. It's become privatized because public actors' funds have been reduced. The gap has been filled by private planners working for developers who are paid for through the development process. And so what you have is a political project which is allowing or leading to a structural fundamental change in how the planning system works. On the one hand, it's a political project in saying that the state shouldn't be planning things. It should be more flexible, should be relying on other actors. That's one charitable view. Another one would be that, of course, those companies have huge political power. Right? Companies, I won't say any names because it's been recorded, but there are very well documented examples of those companies also influencing public policy. McKinsey's and others recently, some research has showed, also help to set models in place that help companies to do public action. So you've got a variety of things going on, which some people are trying to put together as a form of neoliberal thinking. But I think it's more about, it's a combination really. It's a combination of then thinking also perhaps about austerity in the context of the global financial crisis. Who are you going to turn to, whether it's these private actors with resources and money? There might even, in the case of property development, be pension funds, institutional funds, sovereign wealth funds. How do we change the political system to enable them to help us deliver public policy, whether it's building new houses or whatever? It's a very powerful political narrative within that. And it is one that argues that the state can't do these things, but this shouldn't be doing them. Now, that is a very, I would argue as well, of course, there's a real geography to that. And much of what is in here is about a London model or about an English context. I mean, the scale of austerity cuts in England to local government are on a different scale to anywhere else in Europe, probably only comparable to some US cities. It's a social experiment. It's basically trying to entrepreneurialize the local state, trying to get them to think more. And what we've been looking at in our research, I mean, there's many aspects of the WIG project, Tuna and I did, but we looked also at how the big challenge in London is for centre-left politicians, because what they've been trying to do is try to promote growth, trying to promote new developments, which are politically hugely controversial because they're very expensive, not affordable, but they're trying to capture value from that for public projects. So there, we argue this is a form of kind of pragmatism, if you like. It's very, very, very controversial because, of course, one answer to all of this is to say, embrace the model, have more development, great, capture the value. You know, why not? The money's there. If that kind of model is going to work anywhere, it's going to work in a city like London, where there are huge. Some local authorities have been better than others at managing that process. In some cases, we've come across cases where they have, going back to the second point, they've employed lawyers and other teams to get better contracts. Again, in the name of a kind of type of pragmatism, to say that, look, it's the only game in town, the language that's used, everybody uses that expression. We have to do the best we can. Why don't we employ a lot of lawyers to help us capture more value and get the best out of this that we can? Again, that's been quite controversial. Centre-right authorities within London, some of those boroughs, because each borough has its own leadership, have been a little bit more ambivalent, in fact, because some of them are trying to resist development because they are conservatives, right? They're trying to NIMBY groups, if you like. But some of them, ironically, have embraced the agenda for more growth. And what they found is that the people that move into those build-to-rent apartments tend to be left-of-centre Labour voters. They've actually destroyed their own electoral base locally by this type of housing, which is it's a very interesting kind of perverse outcome, perhaps. So there are multiple levels. I'm just giving a very general answer, right? But I thought the question is a very good one. Right? There are multiple political projects. And there are forms of resistance, as well I mentioned at the beginning. And of course, these things have been better and better understood. That is the second point about the role of lawyers, because there is I found as an urban geographer by background, really, and a planner, that I hadn't ever really engaged with the writings about judicialization that are so big in political science. There are huge literatures about this. And there's much writing, for example, about countries like Brazil and other places where lawyers have had a huge impact on social welfare. What they decide is done often shapes government, the boundaries of government action, of course, it always does, but it has a big impact on. There's some great examples of things like contraceptives and so on, and how legal cases have shaped what is done with public policy in those contexts. And same in the US, of course, at the moment. The problem is, though, that if you rely on judicialization, firstly, certainly in the English case, it's an adversarial process. In other words, it's one built around conflicts that rather than it being a consensual process, it's a conflictual one. It may not be true in the Netherlands so much, but it certainly is in the UK context. So people who launch technical challenges, it's a challenge, right? It's a real fundamental argument against it. And that makes the role then of politicians very difficult, who are trying to be more pragmatic in some cases and trying to make the best of it, and then finding that some of what they're doing is attacked legally, and then there are huge judicial costs, which are also hugely expensive. So there are costs of because it comes back to the question about, perhaps the third point as well, the question about whether it's a good way of governing a city, whether it makes sense, in a more normative sense perhaps, to have a situation where you have almost a cascade or pyramid of contracts around which governance is being delivered and organised. And it comes back to fundamental questions over the coordination of those contracts, the oversight, whether, and I'll give you an example. So where some of this came from originally was that the UK government was saying, we believe in localism, right, as many governments across Europe do. So I did a bit of a thought experiment about the neighbourhood I live in South London. And I thought, what do I really have control over here? Anyway, well, the politicians, I said in my street, the streets lights are delivered by Skanska on a 25-year set contract. So if I wanted to argue for more lighting in the evening, for example, for safety, or turn them off during an energy crisis, things that happen, I don't go to the politician because they've given away 25 years worth of responsibility to a company. And by the time you're 10 years into that contract, all the people involved in negotiating it are probably gone. No one even knows what. I've been interviewing people recently about some of these long-term contracts who suddenly realised that the contracts are about to finish. But the people that negotiated them in 2000 are probably dead in some instances. And so it becomes becomes incredibly complicated. Once you add to the street lights where I live, the road infrastructure, the utilities, the transport, all the buses are run by a French company. The Govia and Keolis were running the trains for a while. They were so bad at it, it actually collapsed. Where are you turning in that place as a citizen? Right? Even in the case of, for one example, in the case of London, community engagement is now done by private consultants on behalf of a developer. So all the things we're teaching our students, you know, how to engage with the community and all this stuff, you know, to really put our heart and soul into. And then the people I speak to, the former students, say, well, we don't do it anymore. It's done by the developer. And some of them have set up their own companies, our students, to be the. So is that really a sensible way of governing? It's a question, I mean, I haven't really answered it, but I've thrown up. But I'm interested in your point. I mean, in terms of where lawyers can come into this, there could be a very strong progressive element to that as well, which we do show in some of the work.
They could, but the funny thing is also then you are putting the onus on a professional group of people, which especially see themselves as service providers.
Yes.
And lawyers see themselves, yeah, we draft contracts. We draft contracts for the one that pays for drafting of the contract. We don't do anything. I mean, you're in a court of law, not in a court of ethics.
Yes.
So lawyers see themselves often as, not all, because there are some activistic lawyers, but many, of course, see themselves as a basically service provider, middleman.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So
It's
a difficult
follow-up question.
Yeah, there's still a question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's partly answered. Just back to the point about relational contract. Yes, you see, short answer, they are becoming more relational. They always have been, but there is a lot of interesting research to show that the power in contract writing lies with those with the most resources and skills and knowledge. Where do those people exist? I mean, and what's happening is that passes back to some of the legal people. There's a huge argument over the balance between more standardized contracts that appear to give public actors more control, because you use standardized good practices, and the flexibility of contracts to deal with local circumstances and differences. Many of the private companies don't like standard contracts. They like their own contract in a different, more relational way. So again, it's another hugely politically contentious point, because the answer that the British government always gives to everything is standardise, because they somehow putting the same model on top of everywhere will structure the relationships. That's not what private companies want, and there's a negotiation that goes on around that. Yeah, there's a lot of there's a lot of work about relational contracting. The work you talk about, I mean, it's actually excellent on this stuff. There's not enough people write about that work on contracts as a relational practice. There are some anthropologists who write about this. Annalise Riles' work on the ludicrous nature of contracts that are given this very formal status, but as she showed in her work, half the contract often remains on the photocopier. Someone forgot to pick it up because no one actually ever read the contract. It's very interesting anthropological writing about that, which I think again is also a hugely important part of some of this.
Okay, I saw some hands.
I think the answer's not short.
Yeah, Jochen and then Luca and Willem.
So me first. Yeah.
Jochen, you're first.
Thank you, Mike, for this rich and interesting talk. Fascinating. I want to continue with the issue of value capturing, which you say, well, that is a very dominant theme in urban development at the moment, and a legitimation of how things go. One, you say, but is there, you question whether there's really value capturing. You gave the example of a multi-million project where 1 million was thrown at the which is one thing. On the other hand, the value capturing is probably not even enough to fill the gap that is left by the dismantling of the welfare state. Or having said that, London is also still a very attractive place, also because of reasons outside the politics of the city itself. So there is a lot of money to be made. Is it thinkable that we come up with very different systems of value capturing that would enable a better public sector? We had value capturing is not in itself, it's something new. In the past, we called it taxing. What you see is that in part of this whole story that you have is that you get a project spatial logic to where money is made and put into the collective. Well, in the past, certainly in the city of Amsterdam, there were all kinds of mechanisms, land lease was also in housing, where money was made, value was captured, but then redistributed on the level of the city as a whole. Why did you lose that kind of mechanism? Or do you still see room for things like that?
Maybe let's collect the questions.
Yeah.
Yes, thanks. I thought very thought provoking, and so I bring back what you thought to provoke in me, and so as a question to you as an academic, but also to us. So in such a context, don't we think we have a choice between two options? One is putting our energy as educators, researchers, in trying to understand how to use such a system for the good. Choice B is to say, this system is fundamentally wrong, so we should put our energy in imagining, experimenting with alternatives. So, do you think we have this choice? And if we do, what is your choice?
I think Willem still had one more question.
Yeah, well, it piggybacks a bit on what Jochem already asked. Basically, referring also to my previous question. So, isn't there any sort of endogenous change within the Labour Party, for instance, for people that are actually running a campaign that is focusing on dismantling this system and therefore indeed sort of try to capture value through a municipalized kind of system, right? A more collective kind of traditional social democratic agenda of capturing the value and redistributing it among the people. So is there no electoral potential for actually running such a campaign?
I see one more question from Nagwa. Yes.
Hi, I'm a PhD student. I have a very simple question actually. What's your opinion on the Social Value Act? I mean, your presentation, I was trying to digest it. It's very informative and very deep, but I also feel that there's this whole progress over the social value of what's the purpose if things are not moving towards that direction.
Okay, I think we can.
Okay, thank you again for the comments and questions. I'll come back to the value capture angle first, or betterment, it used to be called in the English context. Well, I think what you hit the nail on the head really, which is the issue is around land ownership and its cost. And what you see in a place like London is that on the one hand, the investment flows you would think would make it an obvious place for value capture. But the consequence of market action to generate finance and generate return inflates the cost of land and cost of development. And so you have a cycle that emerges where, even in the case of someone like Wembley, where there are huge amounts of money being made, any attempt, and recently in 2022, the local authority has tried to add some extra measures to capture value because there's so little public benefit. They've been, again, challenged in legal process by the developer Quintain because they are saying that if you put any additional burden, we cannot generate the returns to make a profit. Therefore, we will not make the development happen. Right, so you're always in this position where development is only conditional. What's called viability in the language of public policy in England. It's only viable, and one of the things that these professional bodies have set is that a standard form of profiteering in London or in other places in England, big cities, is about 15 to 20% profit. So if you can't make 15 to 20% profit, you won't build any affordable housing, you won't have any money to capture. And so that's how the developer think, or the investors think. But to be fair to them, the land is so expensive and the development is expensive. It's a costly city for development. That actually that's a difficult planning problem, because the more you try to impose what seems like a huge flow of resource, actually becomes incredibly costly if you add more planning restrictions. And so this is the problem with a market-oriented system, that the other side of that is, of course, in places without much growth, you don't get any development, any value capture at all, because there's nothing to capture. There's very little profit to be made, right? So we've got to, it's a fundamental difficulty, and you're absolutely right. It's an interesting discussion, not just in England, but elsewhere, about capturing land values in different ways. You know, the way in which taxation has shifted in many European countries is towards, well, not shifted, it hasn't shifted enough. It's mainly about income. Whereas in fact, what you now have is land and development as an asset class, which is where the real inequalities lie. Of course, they're related to income as well, but the big inequalities in a city like London are how much you own. If you own your own property, you yourself have become part of that privatised Keynesianism that's been written about for the last 20 years. You rely on your asset for your own welfare. The welfare is being cut back for public sources, so you rely increasingly on your private welfare. It goes on and on and on. But so there's a vested political interest in certain people maintaining those property values, which just adds to the difficulty of a debate about changing the system. Right? This is what Mrs. Thatcher always argued about neoliberalism. Once you embed it into people's lives, it's very hard to take it out again. And that's exactly what goes on. So I think there are the Lincoln Institute doing some interesting work at the moment on different forms of value capture, and community trust and these sorts of things. There's an interesting debate going on, but it's a debate that's coming a little bit late, I think. It's a debate that's always been there, actually, but it's coming a bit late in the current context. That's helpful. I mean, just with the lawyers here, there are things called Section 106 agreements, which are supposed to be the legal agreement between a local authority and a developer or a house builder about the amount of what's captured. The trouble with those is that they always backload the public benefit. So the developer says, I need to make the profit first, then in 10 years' time, I can provide the affordable housing or the clinic. There's a lot of anthropological research to show people forget. That sounds extraordinary to think, but the public policy actors move on. And then what did they ever agree to? And then the developer says, well, the market's gone down, there was COVID, you can't expect us to provide it. Even though at that stage they've already built a lot of housing and generated a lot of profit, they can no longer find the value at the end. Right? So there's a huge argument going about that. And it's a very ineffective form of capture, actually, in that sense. The other questions very quickly, so that we go on. So Luca's question about where do I sit with that? That's a very good question, becoming a head of department, because of course, in the English case, the RTPI also helps to shape the pedagogy of planning profession and teaching. In other words, we have to teach courses. I don't know if that's true for the Dutch Planning Institute, but here I can see some smiles. I mean, in England, sorry, you have to get things accredited by the Royal Town Planning Institute. They tell us what needs to be taught. So that's part of the problem in terms of what we can deliver to people. I mean, I was saying that as a head of school coming up. It does, but I think what you do, of course, is you teach planners to be critical social scientists, I think, and also give them the skills they need to do the job. And the interesting thing is that second part has become more, I didn't mention financialization much in the talk, but it's become more financialized and about understanding contracts. You know, former students say that's where former students say that's what they need to know about. We're under pressure to provide them with more critical social science interpretation. So I think it's very, very, really, pretty, and I think your question is absolutely right. It is a pretty fundamental challenge to us as teachers as well. The pedagogy of built environment work. What are we trying to do? Right? What should they know about? Should they be hearing more from lawyers and others? Yes, I think it's the answer to that. Well, what do they then hear less of? Can't do everything. So what is less important? I still think the community engagement stuff is fundamental. I mean, co-production and other things, but co-production in this context is as Tuna's other work has shown, is a real challenge. And then finally, on the Social Value Act. So there's a piece of legislation in England, 2011-12, which was called Social Value Act. It was supposed to be a way of rethinking value through a more foundational economics kind of route, although that's not the language, of course, that the people who invented it thought about it. They thought about it in terms of the discussions we've had here. In other words, you can provide social infrastructure in a way that doesn't come from the public sector, it comes from other sources, but we can use it for there's a lot of local instances where local authorities have tried to use those acts. I haven't done any direct research on that, but I know that they are met and confronted with these structural forces. In some ways, though, there are other areas where, and there's some interesting examples in London where, for example, what you find is where it's not a local authority, but another public body, for example, an urban development corporation that's given land, they're able to use that much more effectively and give land to certain community projects and other things. So there's again, back to the point made earlier, land ownership potentially is key, whether the public sector could own more land. What's happened is that local authorities and all public agencies in England have been forced to sell land. Right? There was a huge audit done of all public assets, and they should sell them. Right? Boris Johnson set up an automatic map in London of all public sites for developers to look at and say, I want to buy that, I want to buy this. And so in the English case, what you've seen is a hollowing out of public assets. Many of those things are things like land for community centres and stuff like that, which have been hollowed out by governments being told they have to push it back into the private sector. And that's been a huge problem. It's the opposite of the social value agenda. Right, so but one final point, more positive note, I think, and in fact, some of the people here have been, I think, leading on this, is the debate about foundational economies. I think there's a lot of really interesting work going on around how you start from that point and say that we need to think about the foundations that make a place what it is. How do we build those foundations from not just the bottom up, but also the top down? How do we get everybody to coordinate? I think that's a very positive agenda coming through, and the remunicipalisation work, Andy Cumbers and others, I think it's beginning to show that there's some political mobilisation of some of those agendas as well going on. Not so much in London, but elsewhere.
Do we have more questions? Mike? Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm Ewing Chen. I'm from University of Wyoming and visit the geography department here. Yeah, and I have a question because you mentioned about the like Canadian pension fund invest in UK, but it's very interesting that Canada just passed the law this year. They try to set an invitation for the foreign capital to invest on the real estate market. So I've been very curious about how UK treat this foreign capital, especially in the housing market.
Yeah, so what happened was in 2012, as part of this discussion that we've been talking about, the national government launched a review by somebody called Montague, who was a property developer. So it became known as the Montague Review. And it was a review to try to work out ways of setting regulations to encourage institutional investment to come into the English property market. And that's the part of the background, some of the discussion here, actually, in terms of the shift of opening things up in ways that would allow the Canadian pension fund. If you think about what it is that institutional investors want, they want long-term returns, they want guaranteed markets as much as possible with few risks in the long term. And what's interesting is that the people that fit that bill are paradoxically short-term renters who are students who are going to pay for the room. I mean, you can keep on putting the rents up. I mean, some of those rooms in those places in Wembley are well over £1,500 a month, for example. You can keep on. You also want to attract. This is one of the interviewees told us. I won't say from which company, not in Wembley, somewhere else. Said our ideal tenant is a public sector worker who can't afford their own house and will struggle to move, and they're never going to get a big pay rise, so they'll never leave in a hurry, like someone in the private sector who might get a big. And so they make wonderful patient payers, in the sense they're patient market. They will pay us long term. And so there's all sorts of, the ethics of that are of course very problematic, but it's the logic of a market system, of course. In the case of Canada, I'm just saying one thing, their pension funds and other things have been leaders in this process internationally. They invest also in a lot of airports in Britain. I don't know who invests in Schiphol, but Manchester Airport, for example, there's other places where these pension funds have been extremely active, and it's going to become more active because there are more and more pensioners in the global north longer term. And so some people will say that's a real opportunity, of course, because it's a way of, this is what the Montague Review is about, trying to tap into a source of finance and get them to build what you need for public policy, social policy. but with some of those implications that I think we discussed. But also, don't forget, a lot of units have also been built, so things do happen as well.
Thanks, Mike. I think I don't want to tire you anymore. It was wonderful. I had a fundamental question myself, but I'll leave it to Priya when we are there for drinks. I was going to ask you what kind of a state you prefer, but it's maybe a fundamental question. On behalf of the UGoveRN, I would like to give you a little present, and thank you so much for coming here. Before we close off, I would like to thank to the star of this organization, Anna Hag, which is sitting over there. She's the apprentice student who coordinated the entire day today and tomorrow. Thank you, Anna. And Igor Pessoa, he's not here right now. Andre Legarza and Sarah Özlul, thank you very much for being involved in this organization. And thank you all for being here and being involved. And if you are thirsty and if you want to join us, we will go to Korea to have drinks. First drinks are on the UP group.